Stop and think about this for one moment. A ceasefire was announced. The guns went quiet. The headlines celebrated. Politicians gave speeches about peace and diplomacy and the power of negotiation. Social media filled up with relief and cautious optimism. And then, within days or weeks, the same violence returned, the same people were dying, the same positions were being held, and the same structural forces that caused the conflict in the first place were still sitting there completely untouched, doing exactly what they were doing before anyone signed anything. And here is the thing that nobody on television is saying clearly. This was not a failure of the ceasefire. This was the ceasefire working exactly as it was designed to work. Because this ceasefire, like most ceasefires in modern conflicts, was never designed to end the war. It was designed to manage the optics of the war long enough for the political pressure on the parties to ease. And once that pressure eased, the incentives that drive the conflict reasserted themselves, and the conflict resumed. What you are watching is not a peace process that broke down. It is a conflict management system operating exactly as designed. And until you understand the difference between those two things, you will spend the rest of your life being surprised every time a ceasefire collapses. So let us stop being surprised. Let us talk about what is actually happening and why. And if this kind of structural honesty is what you have been looking for in a channel, please like this video and subscribe right now, because cutting through exactly this kind of surface level narrative is what we do here every single week. In this video, we are going to answer 3 questions. First, why do modern ceasefires so consistently fail to produce lasting peace, and what does that tell us about the real function they are serving? Second, what are the structural forces that no ceasefire agreement has addressed in this conflict, and why do those forces make a return to violence almost mathematically inevitable? And third, what would actually need to change for a ceasefire to mean something real, and how likely is that given the current alignment of interests among the major actors? Let us start with the context reset, because the framework most people are using to understand this ceasefire is the wrong one. The framework goes like this. War is bad. Ceasefire is good. If ceasefire collapses, someone violated it. Someone acted in bad faith. Someone is the villain. And the solution is more pressure on the villain to honor the agreement. This framework feels logical. It is also almost completely useless as a tool for understanding why conflicts persist, because it focuses entirely on the behavior of the parties and completely ignores the structural conditions that make conflict rational for those parties. Here is the deeper framework. Conflict does not continue because people are evil or irrational. Conflict continues because the parties to it have calculated correctly from their own perspective that the cost of continuing the conflict is lower than the cost of the concessions required to genuinely end it. A ceasefire does not change that calculation. It pauses the active violence while the calculation is temporarily disrupted by external pressure. The moment that external pressure eases, the calculation reasserts itself and the conflict resumes. The media narrative focuses on who violated the ceasefire. The structural reality is that both sides are doing exactly what rational actors with their specific set of constraints and incentives would do. And until the underlying calculation changes, no piece of paper signed in a diplomatic meeting room is going to produce a different outcome. Now let us build the power map, because a ceasefire is not just an agreement between two parties. It is a product of a specific alignment of interests among a much larger set of actors. And understanding those interests explains both why the ceasefire happened and why it changed nothing. Start with the American administration. Publicly, it is presenting this ceasefire as a diplomatic achievement. Evidence of American leadership, proof that engagement works. Strategically, what the administration actually needed was a reduction in visible conflict intensity at a moment when the economic and political costs of the war were becoming domestically unsustainable. Oil prices were threatening to push past the threshold that triggers visible consumer pain and political backlash. Congressional support was fraying. Allied governments were applying quiet pressure. The ceasefire gave the administration a way to declare a partial victory, ease the domestic pressure, and buy time without having to make any of the structural concessions that a genuine peace would require. That is a rational use of a ceasefire from the administration's perspective. It is just completely different from what the word ceasefire implies to most people watching the news. Now, the primary party on the other side of this conflict. Publicly, it is presenting acceptance of the ceasefire as a humanitarian gesture, structure, evidence of its willingness to engage with peace when the international community demands it. Strategically, what it actually needed was time. Time to regroup, rearm, resupply, reassess its tactical position, and allow the international pressure that had been building against it to dissipate. A ceasefire is operationally useful for a side that has been absorbing sustained military pressure. It provides a pause that allows damaged infrastructure to be repaired, supply lines to be restored, and political messaging to be recalibrated. Agreeing to a ceasefire costs this party nothing. It was not prepared to give up temporarily and buys it everything it needed in the short term, which is exactly why it agreed. Now, the regional actors who brokered or supported the ceasefire, Qatar, Egypt, whatever combination of intermediaries was involved in this particular case. Publicly, they are presenting themselves as peacemakers, as voices of reason in a region consumed by conflict. Strategically, what they actually needed was to demonstrate relevance and utility to both the major powers and the parties in the conflict, because their own security and economic interests depend on maintaining relationships on multiple sides simultaneously. A ceasefire that they helped broker gives them leverage with everyone. It does not require them to push for structural changes that would force them to choose sides in a more definitive way. So the brokers have a strong incentive to produce ceasefires that both parties can agree to, which means ceasefires that do not require either party to give up anything fundamental. And a ceasefire that does not require either party to give up anything fundamental cannot produce lasting peace. It can only produce a pause. And then there is the international community, the United Nations, the European Union, the constellation of governments and institutions that issue statements and pass resolutions and call for restraint. Publicly, they represent the collective moral voice of the international order. Strategically, they need the appearance of relevance without the responsibility of enforcement. Passing a resolution calling for a ceasefire allows international institutions to demonstrate that they exist and are engaged without committing to any of the hard choices that would be required to actually enforce compliance. When the ceasefire collapses, they call for another ceasefire. The process continues indefinitely. Nobody is accountable. Nobody is required to do anything that costs them something real. And the conflict continues. Now let us get into the structural facts, because here is where the real story of why this ceasefire changed nothing actually lives. Structural fact 1. None of the territorial, political, or resource disputes that caused this conflict have been addressed by the ceasefire agreement or by any document currently being negotiated. This is the most basic structural reality, and it is the one most consistently ignored in mainstream coverage. Conflicts are not caused by violence. They are caused by incompatible claims over territory, resources, political power, or security guarantees. Violence is how those incompatible claims get expressed when no other mechanism is available to resolve them. A ceasefire stops the violence temporarily. It does not resolve the incompatible claims, and as long as the incompatible claims exist, the violence has something to return to. In this conflict, every fundamental question that was unresolved the day before the ceasefire was announced is still unresolved the day after. Who controls what territory? Who has access to what resources? What security guarantees each side requires before it will genuinely stand down? What political arrangements are acceptable to populations whose entire identity is wrapped up in the outcome of these questions? None of these questions were answered by the ceasefire. All of them are still there, still generating the pressures that produce violence, still waiting for the pause to end so they can reassert themselves. Structural fact 2. The military incentives for both parties still favor continued conflict over genuine settlement, and that calculation will not change until the cost of conflict becomes higher than the cost of compromise. This is the hardest structural fact to communicate because it requires accepting something that feels deeply uncomfortable. Both sides in this conflict are, from a cold, strategic perspective, making rational decisions when they return to violence after a ceasefire. The side that believes it can improve its territorial or political position through continued fighting will continue fighting when the opportunity arises. The side that believes that accepting a settlement now would lock in a position weaker than what continued fighting might eventually produce will delay genuine settlement. Ceasefires do not change these incentive structures. Only a fundamental shift in the military or political environment changes them. Either one side needs to reach a position where continued fighting genuinely cannot improve its situation, or the cost of continued fighting needs to rise to a level that makes compromise look attractive by comparison. Neither of those conditions currently exists in this conflict, which is why the ceasefire changed nothing. Structural fact 3. The domestic political audiences on both sides have been prepared for conflict in ways that make compromise politically dangerous for any leader who attempts it. This is perhaps the most underappreciated structural obstacle to genuine peace. In both societies involved in this conflict, years of narrative building, of stories about who the enemy is and what they represent, of framing the conflict as existential, of building political identities around the struggle, have created constituencies for whom any genuine compromise looks like betrayal. A political leader who tried to make the concessions necessary for a real settlement would face immediate and severe domestic backlash. They would be accused of weakness, of selling out, of betraying the people who died in the conflict. The political cost of genuine compromise is higher in the short term than the political cost of continued conflict for leaders on both sides. And since political leaders make decisions based on the political costs and benefits they face, they will consistently choose the option that allows them to maintain the conflict rather than the option that requires them to make domestically painful concessions. The ceasefire exists in this environment as a tool that temporarily reduces the visible cost of the conflict without requiring any leader to pay the domestic political price of actual peace. Now let us run the scenarios, because from this structural picture, there are three realistic paths forward, and only one of them leads anywhere genuinely different. Scenario A is the pattern continuation. The ceasefire holds for weeks or months. Both sides use the pause for the purposes described above. External pressure eases. The underlying incentive structures reassert themselves. Violence resumes, probably triggered by an incident that each side will blame on the other. Another cycle of international outrage, another round of negotiations, another ceasefire. This cycle can continue for years, even decades. It is the path of least resistance for every actor involved, because it requires no one to pay any of the costs that genuine peace demands. The early signal that scenario A is activating, and honestly, this signal is already visible, is when you see both sides using the ceasefire period to consolidate positions, rearm, and make statements about their non-negotiable requirements that are incompatible with the other side's non-negotiable requirements. When both sides are simultaneously accepting a ceasefire and making it clear that their fundamental position has not changed. You are watching scenario A unfold in real time. Scenario B is the exhaustion settlement. One or both sides reaches a genuine breaking point, not a manufactured diplomatic moment, but an actual collapse of capacity or will that makes continued conflict unsustainable. Economy too damaged, population too exhausted, military capability too degraded, political leadership too destabilized internally. When genuine exhaustion sets in on one or both sides, a settlement becomes possible not because the underlying claims have been resolved, but because the cost of continuing to press those claims becomes unbearable. This kind of settlement is ugly and unsatisfying. It does not resolve the fundamental questions. It just produces an outcome that both sides can live with, because the alternative is too painful. But it is durable in a way that managed ceasefires are not, because it reflects a genuine shift in the cost-benefit calculation rather than a temporary management of external pressure. The early signal for scenario B is economic and demographic data showing genuine societal strain on one or both sides. Not just military setbacks, but the kind of deep exhaustion that changes what populations are willing to accept. Scenario C is the genuine structural settlement. The least likely path, but the only one that actually resolves the conflict rather than managing it. In this scenario, a combination of changed leadership, changed external conditions, and a shift in the domestic political environment on both sides creates a window in which leaders on both sides can make genuine concessions without being destroyed politically for doing so. This requires not just a diplomatic breakthrough, but a fundamental shift in the narrative each side has constructed about the conflict. A shift in what each population understands to be possible and acceptable. These moments do happen in history. They require extraordinary circumstances and usually extraordinary leadership. They also usually require that both sides have genuinely exhausted the military option and arrived at a shared recognition that the conflict cannot be won in any meaningful sense. We are not at that point in this conflict. But understanding what that point looks like is important because it is the only scenario that leads somewhere fundamentally different. Now let us bring this home, because a ceasefire that changes nothing is not just a foreign policy disappointment. It has real costs that land in your life in very direct ways. The most immediate cost is economic. Every day that this conflict continues in a low-grade active state, even during a ceasefire period where full-scale hostilities have paused, the uncertainty premium stays in global energy markets. Oil prices do not reflect only current supply and demand. They reflect what traders expect supply and demand to look like in the future. A conflict that could reignite at any moment in a region that controls a significant fraction of global oil supply keeps an uncertainty premium built into the price of every barrel. That uncertainty premium is money coming directly out of your pocket every time you fill your tank, every time you pay a utility bill, every time you buy anything that was manufactured or transported using energy. The absence of genuine peace, even when the guns are temporarily quiet, has a real dollar cost that is being paid by consumers around the world right now. The longer-term cost is about resource allocation and opportunity cost. Every dollar, every diplomatic hour, every military asset committed to managing a conflict that is not being genuinely resolved is a dollar, an hour, and an asset that is not available for something else. The diplomatic energy that goes into producing ceasefires that change nothing could theoretically go into addressing other global problems. The military spending that sustains this conflict could theoretically go into domestic investment. The political attention that is consumed by the conflict is not available for the policy questions that most affect the daily lives of ordinary people. Managing rather than resolving conflicts is extraordinarily expensive in ways that never show up as a single line item in any budget, but that accumulate into an enormous drag on the societies doing the managing. There is also a deeper cost to credibility and institutional trust. Every ceasefire that collapses, every diplomatic achievement that turns out to be temporary, every peace process that produces headlines and speeches and then quietly fails erodes the credibility of the institutions and leaders that presented those achievements as meaningful. When people watch a ceasefire celebrated as a breakthrough and then watch it collapse within weeks, they do not just lose faith in that particular ceasefire. They lose faith in the entire system of international diplomacy, in the idea that negotiations and agreements and international law mean anything. That erosion of institutional credibility is one of the most dangerous long-term consequences of the pattern of managed ceasefires that change nothing, because the credibility of international institutions is itself a kind of global public good that, once lost, is very difficult to rebuild. My read on this is the following. This ceasefire will follow the same structural trajectory as the ceasefires before it. The pause will provide both sides with what they needed in the short term. One side gets domestic political relief, and the other side gets operational recovery time. External pressure will ease as the headlines move on. The underlying structural conditions, the unresolved territorial and political disputes, the domestic political audiences prepared for conflict rather than compromise, the military incentive structures that still favor continued fighting over settlement will reassert themselves, and the violence will return. Not because anyone wanted the ceasefire to fail, but because a ceasefire that does not address the structures that produce conflict cannot produce peace. It can only produce a pause. Short term, the pause is real, and the human cost reduction during the pause is real, and that matters. Long term, the structural reality wins. It always does. A document that two parties sign when they are under external pressure does not change what those parties need, what they fear, and what they are willing to do when the pressure eases. Only changing those things produces peace. The ceasefire changed nothing because nothing that causes this conflict was changed. That is not cynicism. It is pattern recognition, and pattern recognition is the only tool that gives you an accurate picture of where this goes next. News changes fast. Structures change slow. Know the difference. That is what this channel is built on. And if this breakdown gave you a more honest picture of why this ceasefire is not the peace it was presented as than anything else you read or watch today, please hit like and subscribe right now so you are here for the next one. No panic, no noise, just the next move.